Listen to the voices of the advocates.
Datuk Darryl Goon is a retired judge of the Court of Appeal, Malaysia. He is now a consultant at the firm of Raja Darryl Loh in Kuala Lumpur. He had a career at the commercial bar for more than 35 years before taking the bench in 2018. He was regarded as one of the clearest minded and most articulate advocates of his generation. He was likewise on the bench. We are lucky to have him on Advocates, the podcast. Enjoy. Today on Advocates, the podcast, we are very, very happy to welcome Datuk Darryl Goon, now of Raja Darryl and Loh, who was recently seated in the Court of Appeal of Malaysia. Darryl, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me, Gopal. Considering the stature of some of your previous interviewees, I feel highly privileged. Thank you.
Well, I think it's they who should be, Darryl. Let's kick off. Darryl, let's begin with your childhood and tell us a little bit about your parents, where you grew up, and the influence that your parents and your siblings had on you.
Well, my mother hails from Taiping, which is a town north in Perak. And he comes from a well-to-do family. His father, my grandfather, was a tycoon of sorts. He had timber, charcoal kilns and printing press and factories and that sort of thing. I think he also had a sawmill and the likes. And my father grew up in Ipoh. He was born in Ipoh as well. My mother was a housewife. Father's father came from Penang. The stock actually came from Penang. And I was born in 56 in Ipoh. And my mum was a housewife most of the time. And my dad was in the police force. He was a police officer.
Right. Okay. And how many of you were there in the family?
Well, three of us in the family. The eldest is my sister, and then my brother, and I'm the youngest. My brother now lives in England. He's an accountant. My sister is retired. He was with MAS, the airlines.
Okay, so tell us a little bit about the influence your parents had. Obviously, both your siblings, one an accountant, educated, the other one worked for one of the biggest corporations in Malaysia. Was education a big part of your life growing up?
Well, strangely enough, not at all. I was a duffer and never considered learning of great importance. I think the greatest influence I had when I was young was my father. And he was in the police force, of course. He was always off fighting crime somewhere. And when he turns up for lunch with his officers, I would sit by the side and watch them talk and drink. And they would have their uniforms on, their boots. And I got very taken up by that with their rifle, their shotguns, their rifles, and the army all around them. And my grandfather was in the army during the war. He was there the fall of Singapore, and there were great stories about Granddad. And he had loads of men. He was invited for the VE Day parade actually, but he didn't bother to turn up.
He was in the British Army.
He was in the reserves, in the Malaysian volunteers, and I believe he was a regimental sergeant major or something like that. Quite sure. Loads of stories about him. And the influence I had from my dad was mainly, the forces, uniform service, and there was nothing intellectual about it. We were not a reading family. We were never an intellectual family in that sense.
So how did you go from that sort of background and ending up in law?
Well, after Form 6, and that's another story now, how I got to Form 6, but after getting my A levels, I had earlier wanted to, well, believe it or not, I'd wanted to take a diploma in motorcycle mechanics. But my dad thought that wasn't very wise. I thought about it again. I couldn't do anything else. I thought perhaps I might be able to read law. I was lousy at the sciences. Arithmetic was terrible. I didn't get through sums. I think that was all I could manage. And at the end of the day, it was just something I thought I could do at the last moment without any predilection for it. Not like what is said of Justice Yusofi Abdul Kader, who wanted to be a lawyer when he was age 6 or something like that. Never had that certainty about the law. It was something I just went into because there was nothing else I thought I could do.
So you didn't sort of have a sense of what it might be once you qualified and what you do after that?
Not at all, actually. I haven't the foggiest as to what it entailed or what lawyering meant. I think I had a quick meeting with the deputy public prosecutor before I left. My dad arranged it for me. That he was then the officer in charge of police district in Seramban. He organized for me to meet up with the DPP there, and we had a quick chat. But it didn't mean anything to me. All I knew was that if I were to read law, the idea that I was come back and I would join the Attorney General's chambers. The idea of practicing outside never occurred to me, even though I had a grand cousin of mine, whose name is David Tay, who just passed away last year. David is a partner of Murphy and Dunbar. So he also spoke to me about the law. And again, it was all double Dutch to me. I didn't know anything about the law. My life had always been messing about with the boys in school and armed forces and planes and guns and that sort of thing, but never the law as such.
Right. So even in that, at that time, even the concept of practicing was tied to service, was tied to the Attorney General's chambers, law and order, that sort of thing, because of the family background.
Yes. And in fact, my grandfather had made it clear that a male issue from every generation of the family must serve. So he served, dad served, and I'm glad I got the opportunity to do so towards the tail end of my career in the law.
Okay, so I'm interested. Motorcycle mechanic. Obviously, it takes one type of aptitude, and then to pass the exams to get to do law. How did you make that leap? Did you suddenly become studious?
No, not really. Well, when I was in secondary school, that was in Seramban by then, and reading for the MCE, the Malaysian Certificate of Education, I think that was a Form 5 exams. What happened was, at my first attempt, did not get a credit for my Bahasa Malaysia, or Bahasa Melayu, I think was called then. And at those days, the medium of education was in English. So Malay was just another language, was a subject. So when I failed that, automatically you had to repeat Form 5, and which I did, which I had to repeat Form 5. Now, after repeating Form 5, I then succeeded in getting a credit. So I got past that and managed to go to lower 6 in King George in Seramban. But I had told my dad that since I've spent a year, wasted a year, perhaps he would allow me to read for my A levels in 1 year. Well, he asked if that was possible. I said, yes, that's possible. But that would mean I have to go to night classes. I had an ulterior motive, of course, because that meant I could mess about with the boys during the daytime, go to classes at 6 p.m., and ride my motorcycle with the lads. So my dad said, I told him and said, look, if I don't get through and I have to do it the second year, I would have not lost anything. It would have happened anyway. But if I succeeded, I would have saved, I would be back on track, as it were, in the number of years taken. So what happened was he agreed. I remember I had a talking to by the headmaster in King George. Why are you not back at school? And I said, look, I'm going to the night classes. He was fuming. And I gave him a reason. He didn't think it was good enough. By the time we started classes, we really had about 6 or 7 months to prepare for the A levels. So what happened was I crammed, and lo and behold, I succeeded. So I managed to get three principals, enough to get through the A levels, but not enough to get into a good enough university. So that presented another problem. What it meant was, do I repeat the A levels and then go back to having been late by 1 year, or take my chances with my existing results, which weren't that great? The motorcycles got in the way, of course. And then what happened was I decided to take a chance. I discovered that there was a college called Holborn Law Tutors in London who did the external LLB program for the London University. So what I did was I signed up and took my chances there. So that's when I entered the law, and that was in 76.
1976.
That's right.
So your 3 years at Holborn, what was that like? Did you have any teachers there that inspired you? And if you could point to one thing you learned about the law in the University of London.
I don't think I can. I think the experience was extremely beneficial, not from the point of view of learning the law, but also the exposure being abroad for any teenager. And that was extremely, useful for me. Learning to survive, to cook, and to work out things for yourself. And that's a larger part of the educational process. I don't think any particular lecturer or tutor stands out to my mind, but I recall the strongest impetus for me, the pushing force, if you like, was the fact that I'd always imagined my dad and the family suffering back in Malaysia because as a police officer, he wasn't earning a hell of a lot. So what he did was, it was a major sacrifice for him. And I had a fixed rate of £80 a month to survive on. I had to just live on that. So it was pretty tough going. And that was the main motivating factor, that I cannot fail. And that's what I told myself. So what I did was, I really hit the books. And at the end of every year, I would just send back one telegram to my father, and there was just a one word: passed. That's it, and that's all I could afford, But it was the friends I made at Holborn that was quite fun. We had good times
Right.
there. We had good times.
Okay. And then obviously you went to the bar because you couldn't come back to practice in Malaysia after without that. Would that be the case? Yeah.
Yes.
And that one year, which inn were you in?
Well, that was the original difficulty, deciding on which inn. But then I discovered that my grand cousin, David Tay, was from Lincoln's Inn. So I thought perhaps it would be good to just follow in the family sort of, way. I went into Lincoln's Inn. And there were all sorts of jokes about Lincoln's Inn in those days, about having curries for dining and what have you. And I enjoyed myself tremendously. We registered the Council of Legal Education. We had people like Kiru Bakaran was there during my time. Narban, Papa Narban was there as well. Uh, and I think my wife was there as well, but she was hardly around because she was spent her time in the US looking after her sister. And there was a wonderful year. We actually stood for office. We stood for office of the Students' Union, had a Students' Union then. Unfortunately, that year we had two separate teams, a completely white one and a completely colored team. And lo and behold, a completely colored team made it. So I got to be general secretary. The president was South African. Then there was a there was a vice president, Betty, from Hong Kong. And there was someone else, a treasurer, I think, was from Singapore. And there was another lady who was the daughter of Field Marshal Manick Shaw, which is an amazing man.
Right.
When we met him, he was, of course, the Field Marshal who took the British Indian Army right into Pakistan. He came for the call day in a wonderful presence, not a very large person, not a large man, but no, while we didn't know who he was when he first appeared, but everybody made way for him. It was a palpable sense of someone of enormous character, was present. And after succeeding, we became the Students' Union, and we got a call from I think there was a relationship QC or something. I think Crawford QC, someone like that. Invited us for sherry, and suggested that we might co-op the members of the other team, just to make things work. And we were happy to do that. So we had multiple, and we had a great time. We worked very well. We had enormous parties, and I liked that year so much that when I got back, I was determined to buy a car of that year, and I still have it. you know,
Really?
yes, we enjoyed it very much. We had parties, and I remember serving Lord Denning with orange juice. We just partied and partied.
Did you speak with him?
Yes. Well, we had very small tests. We didn't have any serious talk. It's like one of those functions at the bar and how are you and that sort of thing. And I even queued up for his book for him during, I think it was winter when it was launched, and we were all there in a long line waiting for him to sign it. And he had a word for everyone, especially those from Malaysia, because he's been here, I'm told. And he says, yes, he knows so and so from Malaysia and what have you. It was a very nice chat. Very nice chat.
Okay, interesting. And what is the car that you bought?
Well, it was a SLC 280.
Ah, okay. I remember it well.
But yes, it's still here. I still have it.
Okay, now before we deal with the Darryl Goon coming back to Malaysia and practicing, just in terms of academics, you have a master's in law, and I'm more I'm more curious about your diploma in air and space law.
Well, that I were to start somewhere when I completed my Form 5 exams, because I had to retake it as I earlier mentioned. And after having got through the Form 5 exams, I wanted to answer an ad in the papers that Singapore Air Force was looking for pilots. And I'd always been interested since I was 12, interested in aircraft and the likes. And I used to have collections of them, models and books on aircraft. And before that, I was collecting butterflies and all sorts of things, but aircraft was the main stuff. But my mother refused me joining the Air Force. So I continued, my interest in aviation continued. And after the bar, but it was kept at a very low level, undisclosed, sort of undercover, so to speak. And after the bar, I decided to stay on for another year to read for the masters, on the basis that with the masters, I told my dad that I might get a better chance of advancement in the Attorney General's chambers.
Mm,
That was the
mm,
original thinking. So what happened was I then looked up where to go for my masters. I tried applying to the US. I was quite, I was quite disappointed by their insistence that I do the TOEFL, the TOEFL exam, testing the language, that sort of thing. So I did that, and I was actually accepted by Stanford to do a master's there, but it was too expensive. It was so expensive even then. So I looked closer home, looked to the UK, and at that time, it was not very difficult to get into Oxbridge in those days for a second degree. But the subjects were boring. They were Roman law and that sort of stuff, very old stuff, stuffy stuff. And when I looked at the subjects for the LLM in the University of London uh, master's program, they were enormous and were very exciting. They had intellectual property, they had land law south of the Sahara, ancient traditional Chinese law, and a whole variety of restitution and that sort of thing. So I decided to sign up, and I signed up with King's. But it was an intercollegiate course, and I signed up for non-marine insurance, intellectual property, which I read under Cornish at the LSE, insurance under Professor Aubrey Diamond. I also signed up for public international aviation law and space law. And that was the time I said, okay, this is my last chance to do something with aviation. It was at UCL where Professor Bin Cheng was lecturing, and he had an enormous reputation for aerospace law. People came from all over the world to just read law from Bin Cheng. And in the course of his lessons, he spoke of another exam, which is a diploma in air and space law, which covered domestic aviation and not just international law aspects. And that was provided by the London Institute of World Affairs. And at that time, London University had all sorts of little associations, the United Nations, XYZ, and what have you. So he suggested that I might, do a diploma with the London Institute of World Affairs on Air and Space Law, and I agreed because I was so boring then. All of my mates had left, and reading for the LLM, I didn't have many friends, so I thought taking another course was not too bad. And then, in the course of reading Air and Space Law, I had thought or contemplated the possibility of serving at the International Civil Aviation Organization, a UN agency, because that excited me, and bought a lot of books about it, read about it, spoke to Prof. Bin Cheng about it. And after that, I applied for and got a place at McGill to do a PhD in aviation, in space law, and to research in the area after discussing with Professor Bin Cheng. It was the application of criminal law in outer space.
okay.
And what happened was before I left, I went for a short trip to Venice. And I remember vividly, and it was one evening where I was very much alone. It was in St. Mark's Square, and was looking down at the people having dinner by the side, but the cafes by the left hand side or right of the square. Wonderful music playing, and I was standing there. I was saying, "What the on earth am I thinking about? Going to McGill, spending another 3 years to do a PhD in air and space law." I said, "No, that I think that's enough." On that very moment, I decided to go back to London. Told my brother I'm going home and starting to get a job. So I gave up of aviation then.
Then, okay.
Yeah, I was just wondering. You see, you must be the only person I know of that spent an evening at St. Mark's and decided to return home to work.
It was my second time there, and I was all alone. I was really bored, and I felt that no, it's about time to go home and earn bread, as it were.
One more follow-up question, just to turn back to your old school days. I know you're a playful sort of chap. You didn't play too much attention to exam, but did it come as a big a shock to you that you didn't get through the MCE and therefore had to repeat? And was that the impetus to finally for you to knuckle down and work your way through?
Well, I can't say it was. I think the idea of having to repeat the Form 5 exam did create a dent in my sense of my ability. But after that, I did quite well and acquitted myself and could get into the, Form 6. But I chose to do the A levels in night classes, and as a result of which, didn't have enough time to get good enough results for getting into the proper universities.
Okay, so now we have Darryl Goon arriving back on the shores of Malaysia. Your arrow before this was firmly pointed in the direction of service, Attorney General's chambers.
Yes.
What happened?
So when I came back, I had a chat with my dad, who had retired by then, and I was a bit concerned that the language that was used then in the Attorney General's chamber was Bahasa Malaysia or Malay, and I wasn't very proficient at it. So I suggested that perhaps I should chamber first, get called to the bar, and see what other options there were. And Dad agreed, and then I started looking for a place to chamber. Now, that was the difficult part because I didn't know anything about Malaysian law firms. I mean, we were not as informed as the students are today. And what happened was I looked up the papers and saw Lovelace and Hastings. So I called up for an appointment for an interview, went to the offices of Lovelace and Hastings. Then it was in town, I think it was near the Indian Embassy. You go up the stairs and you see a huge room, a hall-like, bare wooden panels on the floor, a sea of tables and typewriters and people working there, with slow-moving ceiling fans tall up there, with the occasional swallow taking a dive, and then you led into a little square glass room. I think it's like a glass chamber. And then I met with Marshbanks, Norman Marshbanks. Had a quick chat, and it was an air-conditioned room, and that was the only room that was air-conditioned. It was his room, and he said I could start when I was ready. So I went out, saw the clerk, and I asked whether there was any allowance. He said none. So I thought about it and decided that was not quite the place I wanted to be in. So I left. Now, one fine day, my sister came rushing back and said, "Oh, I've heard about this firm. It's called Markov and Dean." So I said, "Wow, Markov and Dean. That sounds quite interesting." So I decided to check up, and I found that I had a friend in what was really Markov and Dean. I had a friend, was a Lloyd Tuan B, who is now with Chang and Arif. And he was at the bar with me at the time, a member of Lincoln's Inn as well. And he introduced me to the partner then, and I had an interview with Datuk Kok Wee Kiat. I was showed around the firm by Jennifer Cheong, and I was told I could start. And I never left the firm.
Yeah, yeah. And did you have in mind at that point in time that it was litigation that was going to be your path? Were you open to anything else?
Well, clearly it was litigation. I've never contemplated non-litigious work or conveyancing and the like. And to me, lawyering was just that. You had to go to court. You had to argue. In fact, in earlier days, I always thought in terms of doing criminal law, but I've never done any criminal work as such. And that is, I suppose, how it is in the Malaysian bar. You either have a criminal practice, it's very difficult to have a mixed bag. And the larger the firm in commercial sets, it seems to be that the thinking is that the twin just do not mix.
Hmm. And I guess your Bahasa Malaysia has to be very strong as well in order to do the criminal work.
Yes, probably so. Certainly, yes.
Yeah.
What did your dad think about that?
Well, he left me very much to my own devices. After that, when I joined Marcock and Din, they offered me a place. But before they did so, I went for interviews just in case I might not be offered a place. And the pupil who was with me then was Hacharan Singh, who is now with Taylor's College. And we went for interviews in other firm, and there was this firm sole proprietor who interviewed both of us and promised us a partnership within 2 years. And we were all very excited, Hajran and I. We went back to the office and we thought about it. And then we asked Hajran, how many partners has he got after all these years? And the answer was none. So we were not very convinced that he was going to honor what he said. So, but luckily we were offered a place and we stayed on in Marcock and Din.
So tell us a little bit about the teaching then and the mentors. Was there anyone who was your main teacher in Marcock and Din?
Well, there wasn't a main teacher as such, but there were individuals from whom I felt impressed with in certain aspects of their abilities. I remember Kok Wiket, the managing partner. Now, Dr. Kok Wiket had a very clear mind. It was very interesting talking to him and hearing him discuss matters and issues. He had a very clear thinking process, and that I learned to try to emulate. And then there was Jennifer Chong, who later I became her partner. And Jennifer Chong was very precise. She's one of those ladies who was very a stickler for grammar and the like, and her English was superb. And she would correct us, and she would, want precision, and she was the one who drafted all the documents. So I got that. I tried to get that idea of having precision under my belt. And then when I stayed on as an associate then, legal assistant in those days, I was under Wong Wing Kwai. Now, Wong Wing Kwai taught me something else. He taught me to be strategic about cases, the prosecution of cases and the defense of cases, and not just to deal with a problem head on. There are many ways to deal with it. And that was an eye opener for me. Those were people within the firm whom I felt, I learned good lessons from.
Did the partners allow you a certain independence to do it alone, or were you always there with a more senior guy?
Well, I really had great opportunities in those days. We did a variety of work. I did defense of running down cases for insurance companies, defending drivers charged with dangerous driving, driving without due care and attention, or sleeping while driving. And we did a lot of finance and hire purchase work, banking, foreclosures, 181 petitions, oppressions, company matters, advised, what do you call that, labor industrial matters as well. And then we started doing intellectual property, trademark registration, copyrights, and the right. And the like. So we had a wide variety of work, and which is something, unfortunately, younger lawyers today may not have the pleasure of being exposed to. And in those days, I had the opportunity of doing my own cases quite early on. I did my first trial during the first year of my practice. But nowadays, most young practitioners, as juniors, would not get to do their own trials for years. So that's very unfortunate.
I think the reason why the practice have changed with respect to that as well. But do you think actually in terms of the service that we can provide our clients, that the way that you were exposed to the law initially might be in fact a better way as opposed to now where juniors for years just sat down there and take notes and did research to the senior before the particular junior then is allowed to do the case on his or her own.
I'm not so sure about the impact on the quality of the service provided, but I think the greater impact is in the quality of the advocates that we will get in the future. It's not the same, no matter how substantial a case may be. If you're a junior, it's not the same as running your own case. Running your own case calls for many decisions to be made for the advocate. and the responsibility of taking every step with care and planning, etc., falls on your shoulder. And also, the more often you get on your feet and argue cases, the sooner you get to develop your own style and what you believe to be effective, and you become you, the advocate, the individual. You can only emulate so much, but you can learn techniques and ways of doing things. But ultimately, when you put it together, it is you. That product is you, and that takes a few years of doing your own cases to evolve into that individual and become the advocate that you can be.
Right. One more question before we go into another area. I'm just curious because quite clearly, as a young advocate, you took, matters on your own. You were thrown into the deep end, so to speak. You had great responsibility. Did you feel that as a, say, 2 years, 3 years experienced lawyer, a great deal of pressure? I mean, you are Darryl Goon and you're fighting probably somebody years ahead of you at the bar, and you are on your own. How do you deal with this? Do you in fact experience pressure at all?
Well, I did actually. I had to encounter people like Raja Aziz. And the thing was, I actually looked forward to it because knowing that if you lose, it's not a terrible thing because it was Raja Aziz or something like that. But if you were to succeed, it would be quite fantastic. So it was really something, it was something we, in a way, looked forward to, and you prepared extra hard for it. But I must say that Raja Aziz was someone who did not take advantage of the fact that his opponent is very young. He was truly without equal as a gentleman of the bar. And I have the greatest respect for him as an individual and as a lawyer.
Were there senior members of the bar who did take advantage of your relative lack of experience then?
Well, there were, but there was one who has since passed away, but I'm told I shouldn't speak ill of those who have gone. On the other hand, the law of defamation suggests that that's the only time I can. But be that
Yes.
as it may, I shall leave that alone, I think. I shall not go there.
Right. So I suppose you learn from both sides, from the gentleman and also I suppose from those chaps who take advantage of your inexperience and in those early years actually as an advocate, what's the I suppose what is the key lesson that you took on for as a young advocate in preparing cases and going against the likes of Raja Aziz and all this?
Well, I think I knew very much, very early on, that the only issue, the single most important factor is the willingness to work. I think if you leave no stone unturned, and I enjoy reading the biographies of great advocates. I do have a fairly good collection of biographies, and I often read them when I was much younger at the bar. And it always come across that industry is the single most important element, coupled with, of course, integrity, which is something which is non-bargainable. But if you put in the effort, you would be able to reap whatever benefits from it. So I think I knew very much early on, and that's something which the family, my father, has always emphasized, and the emphasis has always been work. Work comes first, everything else later. Even my dad has always been like that. The family, he didn't have much time for us. Whenever his duty calls, he's off. So that has always been the motto, so to speak. Labore et vetute, he always says.
Moving forward now, it's few years into your career at Marco and Din. Did you ever then felt and you were doing all this huge variety of cases? Did you then felt that okay, now it's time it's time to specialize, or rather, I suppose the practice took you in a particular way that you had to specialize?
Well, I found myself in a somewhat peculiar way because not long after I joined the firm Marcock and Din as a legal assistant, that was in 82, I think it was 83 and 84, there was a breakup of the firm. Four of the partners left. Three of them formed the firm Aziz Ong and Krishnan, I think. And then Wong Wing Kwai set up on his own. And then Kok Wee Kiat himself left to become Deputy Minister of Domestic Trade and Consumer Affairs. Ong Si Sing, another partner, left for High Court bench. And that was only Jennifer Cheong, Loh Yung Kwai, and myself. And that was 1985, 86 or thereabouts. That was about 3 or 4 years into my practice. So, and at that time, Loh Yung Kwai had one foot in Australia, was thinking of migrating, and he was more preoccupied with the idea of moving abroad to Australia. So running the firm was substantially Jennifer Cheong and myself. And I'd been offered partnership after 2 years of practice, and I was then already a partner. And all of a sudden, in 85, 86, we found ourselves, just more or less the two of us, and with a substantial body of employees and lawyers, relatively substantial, and we had to keep the ship afloat. So it wasn't so much the need to specialize, but the need to just get work enough to sustain a fairly large body. So what we did was, and we were never good at marketing, so we decided to just focus on the clients we had, and to try to make as best a reputation, as a bigger reputation we could with what we had. So we did everything that came our way. We did minor debt collections, we did sale of goods collections, insurance work, intellectual property, the whole works, everything that came along we did. And judicial review, I remember earlier on, I had to run to court to stop tearing down of a building that had fallen. It's fallen after a fire in Seramban. And it so happens that the senior partner's father had a unit in that building in Seramban. And what happened was the local authority had issued a demolition order, and I was supposed to get that quashed. So there we are, and I was about second or third year in practice. So I applied for leave to commence judicial review. I got leave from Justice Pei Switching in Seramban, but he refused me a stay. And he looked very concerned when staring me in the face. Said, what if the building falls and people get injured, public? So he refused to stay. So I was left with rushing off to get an urgent appeal. And in those days, you can get an urgent appeal by meeting up with the Lord President and asking for one. So I met up with the Lord President, who happened to be Tun Saleh, actually. That very Saturday, he organized an urgent appeal of the federal court within 3-4 days. And we were before the federal court on Saturday. And by that time, the municipality, the council had got wind of the application. His council appeared and he produced pictures of the buildings. And I remember Justice Wan Sulaiman, I think, asking me, he says, Mr. Goon, let's come down to brass tacks. He says, this reminds me of the Blitz, you know. So, well, I know I lost that, but it was quite enjoyable. I enjoyed myself. That case was quite fun.
One of the things we wanted to ask you about was your experience working through ADA. In two respects, I think. First, I think in terms of what you think it did to the judiciary at that time. And second, I mean, that was the cast of lawyers involved. That was like the Avengers. And I'd like to know what it was like to work with them.
Right. What it did to the judiciary. I think it was a message that came across, and very clearly, obviously, a message that you're never too big and we can tear you down if we want to, by the executive. I think that gave rise to a lot of concern to some judges, but I do not think that itself necessarily negated independence. It's only those sensitive cases that, there were issues of whether the judges were independent enough for it. But working in the team, I was the youngest of the team, actually. There were 7 of us. I remember Raja Aziz, because prior to that, I had been working with Raja Aziz on several fairly large matters which involved the Malaysian Chinese Association. There was a breakup, the Tan Kun Swan cases and the New Pans, and Aziz had led me. And after that, in 88, one day Aziz called me up and said, Darryl, would you like to assist me in a case that I have coming up? I had not heard of anything about the matter because I hadn't hit the news yet. So I said, sure, not a problem. And then, true to Aziz, as a gentleman as he was, he said, wait, before you say that, can you please check with your partners? Because it can be somewhat sensitive. Then he told me about it. That's all right. Then I approached Kok Wee Kiat, the partner, the managing partner, and I asked him and says whether he would object to me assisting Aziz in the matter. And I remember vividly today him telling me, that's Kok Wee Kiat saying, "Can you live with yourself if you turn him down?" And I said, "Well, that's as good a yes as any." And I went back to Unku and I said, "Yes, I'll join the team." So I was the most junior and I was the only one who could type. By then, I'd learned to touch type when I was in university, so I was very good at typing. And the most junior, there was Raja Aziz, I think Param Kumarasamy was there, that Cyrus Das was there, Tommy Thomas, and then we had Zainul Zakaria, Porus Royan. No, that was the second team. Robert was second team, the first team. Porus Royan and myself. So I was the most junior of the lot and had to take notes and had to draft and do all the drafting. And that was very interesting. But we had one occasion we had to work 24 hours. We didn't sleep. And then we rushed to court and couldn't get a decision from, I think it was Justice Ajaib Singh. It was great fun working with the team. I think a lot of the legal stuff was handled by Cyrus Das. And he was already a formidable lawyer then, as and he is obviously very much a lawyer's lawyer, even in the early days then. So he substantially led on the legal side. But Unku was really the leader of the pack, as it were. And finally, we didn't go anywhere. We tried to challenge the tribunal in court. We did not succeed. But finally, Aziz and Tun Saleh decided not to show up at the tribunal. And that was where the whole matter ended.
Yeah, Darryl, just to follow up on that, as you were doing the case, I know it took several months actually before it reached that position. But did you get a sense that, you know what, we can win this? That's we got real strong arguments, and then as it went on, then you then decided, no, we're not going to win this because the government simply won't allow you to win this. Was that ever that sense of that feeling that you and the rest of the team felt as the matter went on?
Well, truth be told, I never really thought about it in that way. It just was a case that we were straining every nerve to get to and to succeed in. Um, but assessing the likelihood of success wasn't something that we set about thinking about, talking about as such. But as matters progressed, and especially after the five Supreme Court judges or federal court judges were suspended, we then realized, and that was the time we realized that there was really no chance. There was really no chance.
Darryl, before we leave this subject and move on, Raja Aziz, I must ask you, especially for our younger listeners, tell us a little bit about him and your experiences with him.
Wow. Raja Aziz, to my mind, was the most noble of our barristers, of our lawyers. And he was truly a gentleman of the bar. It's not because he had great knowledge of the law. He just simply knew what was right and he portrayed what was right and proper. His behavior was always proper. He never spoke ill of anyone. I remember one day in a car with him when he was driving, and he hated being driven. He just didn't like the idea of someone doing things for him. He liked to do it himself, even carrying his own bag. One day I was in his car, and the light had turned green, and we were proceeding, and there was a motorcyclist or a car that shot across, beating the red light in front of us. And there you are, Unku had put up his finger, shaking his finger at the car, and he was about to say something, and I was waiting for something rude, and all I had was, "Look at him, that naughty fella." And that was Raja Aziz. That was a swear word for Raja Aziz already, you know. And he was, he was really, and I remember at his height, we would walk the corridors during the days when we were doing the MCA cases, and I would walk behind him together with a retinue of other lawyers, etc. And there would be TV cameras right in front. He would slow down, ask us to join him, and as we come forward to join him, he would slowly recede to the back, and we all of a sudden we would be in front, he would be behind. He was very shy. He was very shy, and he never wanted any public attention. It never was his idea. He was just a truly a gentleman of the bar and absolutely noble. It was a wonderful person to work with. And I must say that he was a role model for me. I've never wanted to be or never thought of, I didn't like the style of that hard hitting advocate, that strong, bold, pushy advocate. No, I preferred that soft, gentle approach that Raja Aziz portrayed. And he was excellent at it.
Okay, turn now to a little bit about your experience, and I think anyone who's worked with you, I have, Razlan has, we know how thorough you were as a lawyer. I'd like to focus on one area in particular, and that is your medical negligence practice. We've asked a lot of lawyers who've appeared on the podcast about how they prepare for cross examination, etc., etc. But you would have dealt with numerous expert witnesses. So, in a nutshell, tell us, what is your approach to preparing a cross examination for an expert witness?
Well, I think for a start, I would try to attack the expert as little as possible. It would be very difficult to challenge an expert in his field. So that's the first point I have to make. Secondly, of course, one has to be conscious of the pleadings and the ambit of one's case and to try and achieve precisely what is required and not attempt to achieve more for fear that you might destroy your very case because, again, he is an expert in his area. But most experts have one failing, if you like, in inverted commas, and that is they are reasonable. So if a reasonable proposition is put to an expert, more often than not, they are more apt to agree than, say, a layman who is determined to deny anything that is put to them by the cross examiner. So in preparing for an expert, I would consult textbooks. That would be my reference point. So that whatever he says, if it contradicts the textbook, that may be sufficient for me to achieve my objective, either because it is a disputed area of medical practice, and therefore there are two possible ways of doing something which is perfectly acceptable according to the law, the Boehm's test, or if it is so unreasonable and if there's a whole host of literature against him, his testimony may not be accepted as being reasonable or being able to withstand a logical analysis having regard to the literature that's available. So, cross examining experts, one has to take extra care not to go too far, not to sail beyond what is required for fear that you might destroy yourself. Very often that happens.
And as a cross examiner, did you write down every single question you wanted to ask, or was it just point form?
Unfortunately, I did. I used to do that. I remember reading about what is this now? One of the attorney generals, a biography of attorney general in the UK. I forget his name now. It should come back, and he's always advising cross examination is from the head and nowhere else. But I could never do that because I always thought that I could be more precise in my question if I get it right, writing it down. And I always did that. And when I do that, I would then have the alternatives, the sources to contradict the witness's answer should he give me something that's not acceptable, so that I will know what to contradict him with. So, yes, I would prepare by writing out the questions.
Now, we're going to turn shortly to your period on the bench, but I'd like to ask you one question before that, which is, what would be the best lesson that you took from the bar to the bench?
Well, I think I would put it the other way. It's not quite the question you asked, but the advantage I had that I took to the bench from the bar was the variety of work that I had as a junior and later on in the whole of my practice, because that put me in good stead when I was in the civil and commercial division. Because specialization was not so great then as it is today. So I had a wide exposure, fairly wide exposure, never as wide as one would get in the Attorney General's chambers, of course, but wide enough to allow me to go through the daily routine of work relatively simply. So I think the what I could take from the bar was that exposure which I had. Now I couldn't take with me to the bench any idea of the industry at the bar because I think the barristers in the Malaysian bar, are thoroughly spoiled. the workload at the bench, on the bench, is far heavier than any of the practicing barristers at the bar, in Malaysia anyway, because all our work, we will have the nuts and bolts done by juniors. And then, we will polish up at the end. But on the bench, we have precious little help. Workload is tremendous. And we just have to do everything ourselves. And that was an eye opener for me. And that was a very difficult part.
Okay, turning to your time on the bench, 2018, you were appointed a judicial commissioner, and then very quickly from there, a full High Court judge, and then to the Court of Appeal. You were pretty much at the top of your game when you went to the bench. What motivated you to do that?
Well, I think again it harks back to my grandfather, my father, and the idea that one should serve. I remember there was a time when it was suggested that I might join the bench. It was that was well, I was asked if I would join the bench. That was in somewhere in 2005 or six, but I couldn't afford it at that time, unfortunately, because my daughters were in school in England, and the judicial salary was just simply much too low, and the entire salary could not pay for the year's school fees for one of my daughters. So I couldn't afford it. And I was lucky in 2018 or late 2019, early 2018. I was then approached with the opportunity to join the bench again. By then, I was already 62, and I told the Chief Justice then and said, "Look, I don't have many years." He says, "Don't worry about that. You can do what you can to help us out." And which I did, and I was grateful for the opportunity. Till today, I'm grateful to Tun Raus for the opportunity to be able to serve, and I fulfilled my grandfather's desire that every male issue serves, and that's done for me.
This is about advocacy at the bar and at the bench. Obviously, as an advocate, and you were a very, very active advocate, you have a particular way of doing advocacy. Then you were at the bench, and in the words of Gopal Srinivasan, you now became a consumer of advocacy. Right. Now, is there any misconception that we barristers, we advocates think this is what judges actually like to hear? And then when you actually go on the bench, you say, no, I don't really want to hear all this.
There's very much of that actually these days. I think the advocacy has evolved tremendously, from the time I started practice in 1980, 82. I mean, those days, written advocacy didn't exist. Anyone who presented a written piece of work would be frowned upon as having stolen a march or trying to steal a march. But now, when you appear before the bench, and of course there is a range of judges and how much they have read and so on and so forth. I mean, I'll leave that aside. But most, if not all, judges would have read their material, and because written advocacy is just so extensive, by the time it comes to the oral part, I think advocates forget that the situation now is you have to engage the bench on what is bothering them. And very often, judges would intervene with questions, but when they do ask questions, often advocates fail to take advantage or appreciate the opportunity that's given to them to actually cover those points clearly for the judges, because that's what's bothering them. So, advocacy today is not about oratory, it's about effective advocacy. I think lawyers, barristers should learn to engage, to persuade, and connect with the judges as to what's bothering them. And especially in appellate advocacy, as the Court of Appeal, you have a very short window of time for the oral part of it. Now, to be effective, you have to know your case and get a sense of what's bothering the court and what any lawyer or what any judge would think is your weak point and you need to address. And that's the tougher job for a true advocate today.
You're absolutely right, because the quality, I suppose, of the written submission is such now. I mean, most of the time, I think it's pretty decent. So, the question here is this: what is there really any point for oral advocacy anymore? Quite frankly, I mean, you are a judge. You read the papers. You've probably gone into to the to the court, sort of make you made up your minds more or less. So my question is there really any point to oral advocacy anymore today?
No, I don't think judges would have made up their mind when they have read the material. I think what would obviously happen, like any intelligent individual, you would have a view. But that view is maybe changed. And that's where oral advocacy comes in. And I have on many, quite a few occasions in the Court of Appeal actually changed our views after listening to advocates. Now, that is particularly so in the appellate level, where the engagement is relatively short. Now, in a trial, of course, the matter drags on for a period of time, and the judge would have a greater time to think about the case and to get into the skin of the case. And if the facts are quite clear, he would know which way is coming out. But in the Court of Appeal, I think oral advocacy is still important. It is that part which allows you to turn the tide, as it were, if there's one against you.
Okay, no, thank you. Thank you very much for that, Razlan. Thank you, Darryl. We're going to turn now to our last part, which is the rapid fire questions, and the timing's looking just about right. So let me ask you, and I don't know whether your answer will be the same as the one you gave to Razlan a little bit earlier, but the first rapid fire question, which we prefer an answer to be just one sentence, yes or no, or one sentence at the tops. How do the best advocates get you as a judge from their opening submission to judgment?
By getting straight to the point.
Okay. Second, what did you enjoy most about both your time on the bench and at the bar? The intellectual exercise or the interpersonal skills?
On the bench, it's the intellectual exercise and the law, particularly in the Court of Appeal. At the bar, it was everything: the camaraderie, the nature of the work, the people. It was the whole lifestyle that was enjoyable as a lawyer.
The opponent that you respected the most?
Raja Aziz. Respect.
And who did you learn the most from?
Raja Aziz.
And who's the judge when you were at the bar who challenged you the most?
I think it is Tun Richard Malanjun. I don't remember ever winning a case before him. But after I got onto the bench, we got on very well, actually. And then I begin to think that I had bad causes when I was before him. He was very nice to
Very
me when I left the
charitable,
bench.
very charitable. The single most important quality in an advocate?
I don't think there is, but I can reduce it into a combination of two, which is industry and integrity.
A fictional legal book that you most enjoyed?
Well, at the time, the one I most enjoyed was Brothers in Law by Henry Cecil.
Okay, that's a first.
That was quite enjoyable. I enjoyed Rumpole as well, his first.
Yes, of course. Everyone's favorite. So now you've retired from the bench. You're a consultant with Raja Darryl and Loh. If you could go back in time, what would you say to the young Darryl Goon when he has just completed his masters and arrived back in Malaysia? One piece of advice you'd give him.
Work harder. Maybe you might do better. Maybe you might do better.
And finally, a day in the life of Darryl Goon, and you can expand on this a little bit when you were at the bar and now, and on the bench.
Well, when at the bar, it was quite straightforward. The day is not yours. It's dictated by whatever that comes on your table and the meetings, what have you, and the preparations for trial and cases. On the bench, and this was the most difficult part when I joined the judiciary. There was having to wake up at 5:30 in the morning to get to the KL High Court on time, which is at 8 a.m. That would give me an hour to prepare for the chamber matters and the trials or whatever that was fixed for the day. And that would go on till about 5 or 6. And then after that, read the papers for chamber matters the next day. And if it's more complex, take it home. And then after that, at night, to continue finishing up judgments and to repeat the next day. And that was life on the bench, especially at the KL High Court. At the Court of Appeal, I think it was much more fun because the problems would have surfaced and it was more focused on the legal issues, and I enjoyed that very much. And there were fewer judgments to write because then they would be distributed among a panel of three. So that was quite good. At the High Court, we never had weekends. We were writing all the time. Friday evening till Sunday evening, I would finish a judgment, at least 70 to 80% of it, leaving the rest of the week to finalize, to make up the fine points and what have you. Now, today I'm required as a consultant in the firm. I'm encouraged to go in 3 times a week, which I do on Tuesday, Wednesdays, and Thursdays. And I get consulted on a variety of things. I do some in-house lecturing for the lawyers, continuing legal education. And I also lecture in some hospitals when I get invited to do so. And I have more time to spend on the things I enjoy.
Yes, two questions. Number one, what is the best motorbike you have ever ridden? And number two, what is the best riding route you have ever taken?
Oh dear, that's a very difficult question because I don't think there's such a thing as the best motorbike as such, but I do enjoy what I have. I have a Tourer BMW which I enjoyed riding, which provides me with music and all that as I ride. I have a Harley as well, which is also quite good for what it does, cruising. So it depends on the purpose you want your motorcycle for. The best route, I think, is the one I frequently take it here would be up to Kuala Klawang and back via the Semenyih Dam, and that early morning, we'll take a ride there and have breakfast in a horrible coffee shop, which we always go to, but it doesn't have anything to eat, but we're so familiar with the chap there, but, we just still go there and then take the ride back. So I enjoy that ride to Kuala Klawang.
Okay, Darryl, I have one last question. Now, listening to you through this interview and having listened to you on the bench and as a barrister, the one thing that always struck me is that you, in your speech, have no interruptions. You have no ers, you have no rs. And I'm wondering, is that training or is that natural?
Uh,
He begins his sentence with,
No, I'm not conscious of how, but we used to get ticked off for using these fillers by my grandfather, my dad, and, so it's quite unnecessary. If at all, we'll hesitate, but avoid the fillers of R's and ums.
okay. Well, can I just conclude, Darryl, by letting you know, by telling you that the only other person I've ever asked that question of is Jonathan Sumption.
I must confess, if I have any hero, it's him as well. Among my heroes, it's him and Raja Aziz.
Well, Darryl Goon, thank you very much for spending that hour with us. It's been a fascinating conversation.
Thank you for the time. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to Advocates, the podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to follow us on all our social media channels. Leave a review or share this episode and tag us. We'd love to hear your feedback. Thank you.
Listen to the voices of the advocates.